There are moments in history when truth arrives too soon, when revelation outpaces readiness, and in those moments knowledge gets buried, not out of malice, but out of mercy. This is the story of one such moment. It was late autumn 1944. Edgar Cayce lay on his worn couch in Virginia Beach, entering the trance state he'd slipped into thousands of times before. His stenographer, Gladys Davis, sat beside him as always, pen poised over her shorthand pad. The request that afternoon seemed ordinary enough. A grieving father wanted to know what happened to his son, who'd passed 3 months earlier in the Pacific Theater. But what came through in that session was anything but ordinary. For nearly 90 minutes, Cayce spoke in his characteristic monotone, describing with surgical precision a realm between death and rebirth, a place where souls remain fully conscious, watching the living, preparing for their next incarnation with the clarity of students reviewing lesson plans before the semester begins. He detailed the architecture of this in-between space, the councils that convene there, the choices that get made, the memories that get carefully, deliberately erased before birth. When Cayce finally woke, Gladys Davis was pale. Her hands trembled as she gathered her notes. That evening she typed the transcript as required, but instead of filing it in the Association for Research and Enlightenment Archives with the standard catalog number, she marked it Personal Do Not Catalog and placed it in a locked drawer. For over 30 years, that reading remained hidden. When it finally surfaced in the late 1970s, researchers understood immediately why Gladys had buried it. The reading didn't just suggest life after death, it mapped it with such specificity that it challenged every comfortable assumption about mortality, free will, and the nature of human existence itself. If what Cayce described was accurate, then death is not an ending. It's not even a pause. It's a transition into a state of heightened awareness, where your soul continues its education in ways your waking mind cannot yet fathom. The question isn't whether you believe it. The question is, are you ready to see what happens in the space between your last breath here and your first breath somewhere else? Because once you know, you cannot unknow. Once you see the architecture of the soul's journey, every relationship, every struggle, every inexplicable attraction or aversion begins to make a different kind of sense. This is that reading. This is what they didn't want you to find too soon. But if you're here now, perhaps your soul decided you're finally ready. Over the course of 43 years, Edgar Cayce gave more than 14,000 documented readings. Thousands of them touched on life after death, reincarnation, and the continuity of consciousness. But only once did he map the specific territory between incarnations with the detail of a cartographer charting undiscovered country. He called it the realm of preparation. Others in esoteric traditions have called it the bardo, the interlife, the between space. But Cayce's description was unique in its precision and practicality. This wasn't heaven as religion describes it. No golden streets or eternal rest. It wasn't hell either, no lakes of fire or permanent damnation. Instead, Cayce described something far more nuanced. A multi-dimensional classroom where time moves differently, where souls exist in a state of lucid awareness, reviewing what was learned and planning what comes next. Picture a university between semesters. Students aren't in class, but they're not idle. They're reviewing transcripts, meeting with advisors, selecting courses for the coming term. Some are celebrating their progress. Others are grappling with failed credits they'll need to retake. All are preparing, consciously and deliberately, for the next phase of their education. That's the in-between realm. Not a place of rest, but a place of reconnaissance. The reading that was hidden for 30 years came from a father named Thomas Whitmore, whose 22-year-old son had died when his naval transport was torpedoed off the coast of Guam. Thomas didn't want religious platitudes about heaven. He wanted to know where his son was, specifically, actually, truthfully, and Cayce told him. He described how his son had experienced a brief moment of shock and disorientation when the ship went down, followed by a sudden, crystalline clarity. The pain was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was awareness, sharp, complete, unfiltered awareness. His son, Cayce explained, was now in what he termed the first plane of preparation, a realm that still resembled Earth enough that newly transitioned souls could orient themselves. But he wasn't stuck there. He was learning, adjusting, meeting guides who were helping him understand the life he'd just lived and the soul agreements he'd fulfilled by dying young. Thomas asked if his son knew he was being mourned. Cayce said yes. Not only did he know, but he was present at the funeral, standing beside his mother, trying desperately to comfort her in ways she couldn't consciously perceive but would feel as inexplicable moments of peace in the weeks to come. That reading stayed locked away because it was too specific, too verifiable in its emotional truth, too challenging to the prevailing narrative that the dead are gone, silent, unreachable. But what if they're not gone? What if they're closer than you think, in a realm that runs parallel to this one, watching, waiting, preparing for the moment they'll return? If that's true, then everything changes. What happens in the first 3 days after death? Every spiritual tradition has an answer, but Cayce's description stands apart in its phenomenological detail. He described the moment of death not as a shutting down, but as a sudden, profound opening. The physical senses fade, sight, sound, touch, but they're immediately replaced by something far more expansive, direct knowing. In one documented case preserved in the ARE archives, Cayce described a woman who died in her sleep after a long illness. The moment her heart stopped, she experienced what he called the backward pull, a sensation of being drawn rapidly through her own life in reverse. Every moment she'd ever lived appeared simultaneously, not as memory but as lived experience. She felt again the joy of her wedding day, the grief of her miscarriage, the pride of watching her daughter graduate, the shame of a lie she'd told her sister 40 years prior. But here's what made this different from ordinary memory. She didn't just re-experience her own emotions. She felt the emotional impact she'd had on every person she'd ever encountered. When she'd snapped at a grocery store clerk in frustration, she now felt that clerk's hurt. When she'd written an encouraging letter to a struggling friend, she felt her friend's relief and renewed hope. Every act of kindness reverberated through her awareness as profound warmth. Every act of cruelty or indifference showed up as a cold, contracting sensation. This wasn't judgment imposed by an external God. This was pure witnessing, the soul seeing itself reflected in the mirror of relationship. Cause-meeting effect with perfect clarity. Cayce called this the life review panorama, and he insisted it happens for everyone, not as punishment but as education. The soul cannot evolve without understanding the full scope of its impact. Without this review, you'd carry the same unconscious patterns into the next life, repeating the same mistakes endlessly. After the life review, which can feel like moments or months depending on the soul's capacity to integrate, comes the severance of what Cayce termed the silver cord, the energetic tether that connected consciousness to the physical body. Once this cord dissolves completely, usually within 3 days of physical death, there's no return. The soul has fully transitioned, and that's when the real journey begins. Some souls pass immediately through the threshold into the in-between realm, drawn forward by clarity and spiritual readiness. But others linger. They hover near their bodies, near their loved ones, trying to make sense of what's happened. They attend their own funerals. They watch their families grieve. They try desperately to communicate, often succeeding in small ways. a familiar scent that appears from nowhere, a sudden sense of presence, a dream that feels too vivid to be merely psychological. What determines the difference between a smooth transition and a prolonged hovering? Cayce said it came down to two factors: acceptance and attachment. Those who accepted death's inevitability during life moved through quickly. Those who fought it, who clung desperately to unfinished business or unresolved relationships, created their own delay. But even lingering souls eventually cross. The pull of the in-between is magnetic, irresistible, because that's where the real work begins. That's where you remember who you actually are. If you asked Edgar Cayce to draw you a map of the afterlife, he'd hand you something that looks less like heaven and more like a university campus with multiple buildings, each housing different levels of study. The in-between realm, he explained, isn't a single location. It's a spectrum of consciousness arranged by vibrational frequency, what he sometimes called planes or spheres. Where you arrive after death depends entirely on the dominant frequency of your awareness during life. The lower planes, the first and second spheres, resemble Earth so closely that newly transitioned souls often don't realize they've died. Cayce described these realms as having buildings, streets, landscapes that mirror the physical world. Souls wander there in confusion, trying to interact with the living, frustrated when no one responds. In one reading, he described a man who'd been killed suddenly in a car accident. For weeks, he tried to go to work, showing up at his office, attempting to use his desk, bewildered when his colleagues walked through him as if he were vapor. It wasn't until a guide finally appeared and gently explained his situation that he accepted his transition and moved upward into clearer realms. These lower planes aren't punishment, they're orientation zones. Rest stops on the way home. The middle planes, the third through fifth spheres, are where most souls spend the majority of their time between incarnations. Cayce described these realms as vast libraries, healing temples, and council chambers. Here, the earthly form dissolves. You might appear as you did in your prime, or as pure light, or as whatever form brings you comfort and recognition. This is where the work happens, where you review your Akashic record, the soul's complete history across all lifetimes, where you meet with guides and teachers to assess what was learned and what remains unfinished, where life plans are carefully crafted, not as fate imposed from above, but as curriculum you collaboratively design. In these middle realms, time doesn't flow linearly. A soul might spend what feels like decades in study and healing, while only a few Earth years pass. Or the opposite, an Earth century might feel like a weekend in the in-between. Duration is irrelevant, completion is what matters. And then there are the higher planes, the sixth, seventh, and beyond. Cayce spoke of these with reverence and admitted that even in trance, he struggled to find language for what existed there. These are realms of formless awareness, where individual identity begins to dissolve into union with what he called the creative forces or universal consciousness. Souls don't stay in the higher planes for long, he explained, because there's nothing left to do there except exist in bliss. And while bliss is beautiful, it's not educational. Evolution requires friction, challenge, contrast. So souls who touch the highest planes inevitably feel the pull back downward, not as punishment but as purpose. They return to help, to guide, to incarnate again with specific missions. But here's the mystery that troubled even Cayce. How does a soul move between these planes? What allows ascent? His answer was simple and difficult. Release. Release of resentment. Release of attachment to earthly identity. Release of the illusion that you are only the person you were in your last life. The more you cling to who you were, The denser your frequency, the lower the plane. The more you remember who you've always been, beneath the temporary costume of personality, the lighter you become, the higher you rise. And some souls, those who lived with tremendous love, service, and spiritual awareness, ascend so quickly after death that they barely touch the lower planes at all. They rise like heat, drawn upward by their own luminosity. But most of us? We take the slower path, the thorough one, the one with rest stops and study halls and remedial courses. And that's not failure, that's wisdom taking its time. Now we arrive at the part of the reading that made Gladys Davis weep as she typed. The part that Thomas Whitmore both desperately needed to hear and could barely stand to believe. The dead are watching, not all of them, not constantly, but many departed souls, especially in the early phases of their transition, remain deeply connected to the living they left behind, and they can observe your life with crystal clarity, your grief, your growth, your choices, your struggles, as if watching a film they're emotionally invested in but cannot alter. Cayce explained this with both comfort and caution. Comfort because it meant that love doesn't end at death. It continues, transformed but unbroken. Caution because the grieving need to know that prolonged, inconsolable grief can actually bind a departed soul, making their transition more difficult. In the reading for Thomas Whitmore, Cayce described how his son could see his mother's anguish. He felt it as his own. He wanted desperately to comfort her, to tell her he was safe, whole, more alive than he'd ever been in physical form. But the density of her grief created a kind of barrier, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because extreme sorrow operates at such a low frequency that it becomes difficult for higher frequency souls to penetrate. It's like trying to hear a whisper during a thunderstorm. The whisper is there, but the storm drowns it out. This is why so many spiritual traditions speak of the need to grieve fully, but release eventually. Not because forgetting is honorable, but because releasing allows the departed to continue their journey without the anchor of your despair pulling them backward. But here's the beautiful paradox Cayce revealed. Departed loved ones don't want to be forgotten. They want to be remembered with love, gratitude, and celebration, not with the kind of grief that curls inward and refuses consolation. When you laugh at a memory of them, they feel it as warmth. When you carry forward a value they taught you, they experience it as affirmation. When you live fully in their honor rather than dying slowly in their absence, you give them the greatest gift, permission to move forward in their own journey. In another case preserved in the archives, Cayce described a grandmother who'd passed and remained close to her adult grandson for nearly 2 years. She watched him fall in love, struggle with career decisions, and eventually become a father himself. She was there in the hospital room when his daughter was born, a soul she'd actually helped recruit from the in-between realm to incarnate into her family line. The grandson never consciously knew she was present, but he felt her. In moments of doubt, he'd suddenly remember her voice, her advice, her particular way of seeing problems as opportunities. He thought he was just remembering, but Cayce said no. She was actively transmitting, subtly influencing, gently guiding from her vantage point in the borderland between worlds. This watching isn't surveillance. It's not control. It's love continuing to express itself in the only way available across dimensions, through subtle presence, energetic support, and the occasional breakthrough moment when the veil thins enough for direct contact. You've felt this, haven't you? A sudden sense that someone who died years ago is somehow near. A dream where they appear more vivid and coherent than dreams usually allow. A moment when you hear their voice so clearly in your mind that you turn around expecting to see them. You weren't imagining it. They were reaching through, reminding you that death is a change of address, not an extinction. But what they see from the other side is larger than what we see here. They witness the hidden connections, the soul contracts playing out, the perfection in what looks like chaos from our limited view. And sometimes, Cayce admitted this too, they see things we're about to face and cannot intervene, bound by laws of free will and karmic necessity. That's the hard part of watching from the in-between, seeing the car accident coming and being unable to stop it. Watching a loved one make a destructive choice and only being able to send love, never force a different decision. The souls who watch you are not gods. They're not omnipotent. They're students in a higher grade, looking back at you in a lower one, hoping you'll learn what you came here to learn so that one day you can join them in the realm where things finally make sense. And when your time comes, when you're the one watching from the other side, you'll understand why certain things had to happen exactly as they did. But that knowing doesn't come cheap. It comes at the price of lived experience, of pain integrated, of love tested and proven. That's why you're still here, still in the classroom, still doing the hard work of being human. Your watchers know this, and they're cheering you on. If you could design your next life from scratch, knowing everything you know now about who you are and what you need to learn, what would you choose? Would you choose wealth or poverty, health or disability, a loving family or a fractured one, beauty or ordinariness, peace or challenge? Most people assume they'd choose ease, comfort, advantage. But Cayce's reading revealed something startling. Evolved souls often choose the harder path, not because they're masochistic, but because they understand that friction polishes consciousness in ways comfort cannot. He described what he called the pre-birth council, a gathering that occurs in the in-between realm before every incarnation. Present at this council are the soul preparing to incarnate, their spirit guides, and sometimes the souls who've agreed to become their parents. Together they review the Akashic Record. They identify karmic debts, not as punishment but as unfinished lessons. If you abandoned someone in a previous life, you might choose to be abandoned in this one, so you can finally understand the impact of your actions. If you hoarded resources and left others in need, you might choose poverty to learn generosity from the receiving end. But karma isn't mechanical or cruel. The council ensures that every challenge includes the resources needed to meet it. You're never given more than your soul can handle, though it might be far more than your personality wants to face. Cayce described how the soul selects genetic predispositions carefully. A soul needing to learn patience might choose a body prone to chronic pain. A soul working on humility might choose extraordinary beauty or talent that will attract ego inflation, providing constant opportunities to choose differently. Even the historical moment and geographical location are chosen with precision. A soul might incarnate during wartime to learn courage, or during prosperity to learn stewardship, or in a particular culture to encounter specific philosophies that will crack open awareness at just the right time. Nothing is random. Nothing is accidental. Every chance encounter was scheduled in the in-between. In one documented case, Cayce described a woman who'd chosen to incarnate with a severe physical disability. Before birth, while still in the in-between, she'd reviewed a past life where she'd been a physician who showed profound coldness toward patients with disabilities, treating them as less than fully human. Her counsel helped her see that the fastest route to erasing that karmic debt wasn't punishment, it was education through direct experience. So she chose a body that would require her to develop the very compassion she'd lacked, to experience the marginalization she'd once inflicted, to discover strength she didn't know existed. Was that life harder? Absolutely. Was it more valuable to her soul's evolution? Immeasurably. But here's the part that challenges every comfortable theology. Even tragedies are chosen. miscarriages, stillbirths, childhood deaths. Cayce said these were soul agreements, not divine mistakes. Sometimes a soul agrees to incarnate only briefly, serving as a catalyst for a parent's spiritual awakening or a family's bonding through shared grief. It sounds unbearable from the human perspective, but from the soul's view, from the in-between realm, where identity isn't limited to a single lifetime, brief incarnations are acts of service, not losses. This doesn't mean we shouldn't grieve. Grief is the human heart's tribute to love, but it does mean we can grieve with a strange kind of peace, knowing that the soul who came and left quickly completed exactly what they intended. Every life is chosen, even the ones that look unchosen from here. Imagine walking into an exam with all the answers already memorized. You'd pass, certainly, but would you learn anything? That's why we forget. Cayce called it the veil of forgetting, and he insisted it was one of the most compassionate mechanisms in the soul's design. Without it, the contrast between the soul's infinite perspective and the human's limited one would create unbearable psychological friction. Think about it. If you remembered standing in the in-between realm, reviewing your Akashic record, choosing your parents, designing your challenges, how could you ever be genuinely surprised by life? How could you experience authentic fear, spontaneous joy, or real discovery? You couldn't. You'd be an actor reciting lines, always aware of the script. And the soul doesn't evolve through performance. It evolves through genuine encounter with the unknown. The memory wipe isn't instantaneous. Cayce described it as a gradual dimming that begins during gestation and completes somewhere between birth and age 3. In the womb, the incoming soul still retains full awareness of the in-between. It communicates with its guides. It adjusts to the increasing density of physical form. It begins the slow, reluctant contraction from infinite awareness to the single point of, I am this body, this personality, this life. But traces remain, leakages in the veil. Déjà vu is one, that uncanny feeling that you've lived this exact moment before. Cayce said you probably have, either in a past life or as a preview you witnessed while planning this life from the in-between. Inexplicable phobias are another. If you have an irrational terror of water, fire, or heights, despite no trauma in this lifetime, it's likely a memory fragment from a death in a previous incarnation. The veil is thinner around death experiences. They bleed through more easily. Child prodigies are perhaps the most obvious evidence of incomplete memory wipes. When a 3-year-old sits at a piano and plays Beethoven, or a 5-year-old solves complex mathematics without instruction, that's not genetics. It's skill retained from previous lives seeping through the veil before it fully seals. In one of his most fascinating cases, Cayce described a young boy who spoke from age 2 to 4 about when he was the tall man with the dark coat who lived by the big water. He described specific details about a life as a merchant ship captain in 19th century Maine, details later verified by historical records. But by age 5, the memories faded completely. The veil finished its work. The boy forgot, because remembering too much would have interfered with the lessons he came to learn in this new life. But Cayce also taught that the veil can be intentionally thinned, carefully, gradually, safely, through meditation, dream work, and what he called attunement. These practices don't destroy the veil's protective function, but they allow controlled glimpses through it. Why would you want to peek behind the veil? Not for entertainment, not for bragging rights, but because understanding your soul's larger story can restore meaning to suffering that otherwise feels random and cruel. When you glimpse the pattern, when you sense the curriculum beneath the chaos, you don't escape the difficulty, but you stop resisting it quite so fiercely. You begin to work with your life instead of against it. But there's danger here too. Cayce warned against trying to remember past lives, without proper preparation and guidance. Unintegrated memories can destabilize the psyche, creating confusion about current identity and responsibility. Some people become so obsessed with who they were that they forget to be who they are. The veil exists for a reason. It's meant to keep you focused on now, on this lesson, this relationship, this moment, because this moment is the only classroom you actually have access to. The in-between will be there when you're done. The memories will return when you cross back. For now, the forgetting is the kindness that allows you to be fully human. Even if being fully human sometimes feels like amnesia, you are not alone in the in-between. You were never alone. Even here, in physical form, you're not as solitary as you feel. Cayce described a vast, intricate hierarchy of beings who populate the in-between realm. Some human souls who've completed their earth cycles and now serve as teachers, others non-human intelligences he referred to as the lords of karma or the masters of wisdom. Every soul, he taught, has at least one primary guide, a being who's been with you across multiple incarnations, tracking your progress, offering counsel during the in-between, and subtly influencing from the sidelines while you're incarnated. These guides don't interfere with free will. They can't. But they can orchestrate synchronicities, create opportunities for awakening, and send intuitive nudges at crucial moments. That sudden impulse to take a different route home that helps you avoid an accident. That unexpected phone call from a friend just when you needed it most. Not coincidence, guidance. In the in-between realm, these guides become visible, accessible, conversational. Cayce described souls arriving after death and being greeted by guides they instantly recognize, even though they couldn't remember them during physical life. The reunion is joyful, like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Beyond personal guides, there are specialist teachers in the in-between, souls who've mastered specific aspects of spiritual development and now help others integrate those lessons. Cayce described master teachers who specialize in trauma integration, helping souls who died violently or lived in profound suffering to process and release those experiences before planning their next incarnation. There are record keepers, too, beings who maintain the Akashic Records with meticulous care. Every thought, word, and deed you've ever expressed across all lifetimes is preserved there, not as judgment but as data. When you're ready to review your soul's history, these record keepers help you navigate the archive, ensuring you see what you need to see without being overwhelmed. And then there are what Cayce called the midwife guides, beings who specialize in the delicate transition from the in-between back into physical form. They escort souls through the veil of forgetting, stay present during gestation, and ensure the incoming soul successfully merges with the forming fetus at the moment consciousness anchors, usually around the 4th month of pregnancy. But the most mysterious beings Cayce mentioned were the lords of karma, entities he described as maintaining the integrity of cause and effect across the entire system. They're not judges handing down sentences, they're more like systems administrators ensuring that the law of karma functions fairly and that every soul receives the exact experiences needed for evolution. These lords have the authority to modify karmic debts under certain conditions. If a soul demonstrates genuine remorse and works actively to repair harm done in past lives, the karmic consequence can be softened, not erased but gentled. Conversely, if a soul persists in denial or cruelty across multiple incarnations, the consequences compound, creating increasingly difficult life circumstances until the lesson finally breaks through. In one of his readings, Cayce described a soul in the in-between who was preparing to incarnate for the 7th time to work on a single karmic pattern, betrayal of trust. Lifetime after lifetime, this soul had broken promises, abandoned responsibilities, and prioritized self-interest over loyalty. The lords of karma, in consultation with the soul's guides, designed a life where the soul would experience betrayal from every direction, not as punishment, but as education. Sometimes the only way to understand the weight of what you've inflicted is to carry it yourself. But here's the grace in the system. You're never given a challenge without also being given guides, teachers, and resources to meet it. The game isn't rigged against you. It's designed for your eventual success, even if that success takes dozens of lifetimes to achieve. And when you finally graduate, when you've learned what you came to Earth to learn, you don't disappear into some abstract cosmic unity. You get to become a guide yourself. You get to help the souls still struggling through the lower grades, offering them the wisdom you earned through your own long education. Every great teacher you've ever had, whether you met them in physical form or only felt their influence in quiet moments, was once exactly where you are now, confused, struggling, wondering if they'd ever understand. And now they're on the other side of the veil, reaching back, whispering the same thing to you that their guides once whispered to them. Keep going. You're closer than you think. We're here. We see you. You're going to make it. Not every soul in the in-between is preparing for rebirth. Some resist. Some refuse. And Cayce was unflinchingly honest about what happens when a soul digs in its heels and says, I'm not going back. The in-between realm offers something Earth does not: clarity without consequence. In the borderland between lives, you can observe, learn, and exist without the friction of physical limitation. There's no hunger, no pain, no mortality pressing against you. For souls exhausted by difficult incarnations, the temptation to stay is powerful. Cayce described souls who become so attached to the freedom and lucidity of the in-between that they resist re-entry into physical form. They linger in the middle planes, sometimes for centuries of Earth time, serving as guides or simply existing in study and contemplation. But here's the problem: spiritual evolution requires embodiment. Theory without practice is sterile. You can study compassion in the in-between for 1,000 years, but until you incarnate and face a person who betrayed you, choosing forgiveness in real time with real stakes, the lesson remains abstract. Cayce called this the law of spiritual gravity. Just as a ball tossed into the air must eventually return to Earth, every soul must eventually return to physical form to complete its education. The universe is patient, but it's also insistent. Avoidance only delays, never cancels, the soul's curriculum. Some souls who refuse to reincarnate become what he termed earthbound, neither fully departed nor reincarnated, existing in a kind of self-created limbo. These are the entities that psychics and mediums sometimes encounter during seances or paranormal investigations. They hover near the physical plane, often attached to specific locations or living people, unable or unwilling to move forward. Earthbound souls aren't inherently malicious, but they can be troubled and troubling. Their attachment creates distortion. They may try to communicate with the living, creating phenomena that feel like hauntings. Or they may draw energy from incarnated humans, producing the exhaustion and unease people report in certain places. The escape route from being earthbound is always available: humility, acceptance, and calling for help. Guides cannot force a soul to move forward, but the moment a stuck soul asks for assistance, help arrives immediately. The release is instant, the transition gentle. But then there are souls who retreat into the higher planes indefinitely. These aren't stuck in the same way earthbound souls are. They've ascended through healing and integration, but they've also opted out of the Earth curriculum, choosing to exist in realms of light and abstraction rather than return to the density of physical form. Cayce suggested this isn't wrong, But it is incomplete. The highest goal of the soul, he taught, isn't escape from physical existence. It's mastery of physical existence. The ultimate achievement is to incarnate fully conscious, to walk the earth in a human body while maintaining soul awareness, to be in the world without being owned by it. That's what the great avatars and masters have done. They didn't flee matter, they transformed it by bringing spirit into it so completely that the distinction dissolved. For souls who refuse to reincarnate out of fear rather than readiness, the consequences are more subtle but more binding. Fear creates contraction, and contraction locks you in place. Cayce described souls who become so terrified of making another mistake, of accumulating more karma, that they freeze in the in-between, unable to move forward or backward. The irony is that this refusal itself becomes a kind of karma. Eventually, the weight of prolonged avoidance creates its own pressure, and when these souls finally do reincarnate, they often face condensed, accelerated life circumstances, multiple lessons compressed into a single intense lifetime. It's not punishment, it's efficiency. The universe won't let you languish forever. It loves you too much to allow permanent stagnation. If you refuse to take the exam, eventually the teacher calls you back to class. And the longer you wait, the more material has piled up that you'll need to cover all at once. So the souls who refuse to reincarnate aren't damned. They're just delaying the inevitable, because sooner or later every soul returns to finish what it started, including yours. Now we enter the part of the reading that most spiritual teachers would prefer to skip, the uncomfortable truth, the shadow that lingers at the edges of even the most beautiful teachings. The in-between realm has dark zones, not created by God as punishment, not maintained by devils gleefully torturing the damned, but self-created prisons where souls who lived in extreme denial, cruelty, or self-deception become trapped in their own psychological loops. Cayce called these the lower vibrational spheres, and he described them with the clinical detachment of a physician diagnosing a disease. These zones exist because consciousness is creative. If you spend an entire lifetime building a reality based on hatred, violence, or malignant narcissism, you carry that construction with you after death. And in the in-between, where thought becomes environment instantly, your internal hell becomes your external reality. In one particularly harrowing reading, Cayce described a man who'd lived as a brutal overseer on a plantation in the American South. He'd justified his cruelty with ideology, convinced himself that his victims were less than human, and died unrepentant. When he transitioned, he found himself in a realm where he experienced over and over every act of violence he'd inflicted, but from the victim's perspective. He lived in the body of every person he'd beaten, felt every lash,